Okay, so welcome everyone. Today this is the second time we've done a writing panel, and so I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists. And of course I encourage you to take a look at the faculty profile system to learn more about all of them. Our first guest here is Bruce Bond, Regents Professor of Chemistry, of English, I'm sorry. Yeah. It's been a very long week. I've been with 15,000 chemists earlier this week. So. Regents Professor of English, he's got over 700 publications. He's received numerous awards and has received multiple nominations for the Pulitzer Prize. And his list of awards and honors is nearly as long as his list of publications. Next to him is Victor Prybutok. He's Regents Professor of Information Technology and Decision Sciences. He also is Associate Dean for Research in the College of Business. He has over 250 publications. He's been on numerous editorial boards and has been guest editor many times. He has numerous external and internal awards, and interestingly, received a Citation for Excellence in Readability Award. Our final panelist is Wes Bordon. He's Distinguished Research Professor in Chemistry Department. He is also the Robert A. Welch Chair of Chemistry. He's the Associate Editor of the Journal of American Chemical Society, which is the most prestigious chemistry journal. He has over 300 publications, and he's received numerous top awards in chemistry, specifically in organic chemistry. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and all of you are welcome to ask questions as well as we go through. And the first one, I'll start with Bruce, is what are your biggest obstacles in writing, and how do you overcome them?
Okay. Well, is this on?
Yes.
Oh, I
No feedback. Just record.
It's on.
Oh, for recording. Okay. Well, as a poet, perhaps my process is a little different than yours might be. I don't know how many people invested in first of all creative writing, let alone humanities, are in the room. But my biggest obstacle is starting something absolutely new from scratch. It's always easier when you have some momentum going on. It's real important for me in my process to read widely. I'm kind of in the enviable position perhaps of being able to pursue a lot of different interests and renew the process by way of that. I think what I've done in meeting the obstacles of starting from scratch is I read. And it's real important to look at that as part of the creative process. And I emphasize that with my students. And to read widely. Read things tangential to your discipline. Things that might enliven your discipline and broaden the reach of its discourse. Also think about, I know that many people probably who are interested in a panel like this are maybe on tenure track. And your challenge is to sort of meet the demands and I think hold to the conventions that you perceive dominate your discipline. But to do the work that will really endure and perhaps light your passion most, think about shifting your discipline in a very significant way. What is the missing thing in your discipline? What is the discourse that's not there? When you look at the history of literary criticism, it's pretty clear that, or it's related to the history of philosophy, it's pretty clear that we go through periods that are responding to the immediate preceding period, right? And so intellectual thought seems to move in this dialectical fashion. Oftentimes that generates hyperbole and that space for the missing voice of something that will have greater nuance and precision. So think about that in relation to whatever drives you personally. Think about what's missing in the discipline professionally.
Victor, same question. What are the biggest obstacles to writing and how do you overcome them?
So there's not anything that isn't an obstacle to writing if you let it be. That's the reality. And so it becomes an issue of managing yourself to be able to be consistently productive. I agree with everything that Bruce said, in terms of trying to hone your scholarship. And in fact, it's kind of funny when he said, I don't know who here is involved in creative writing, but I want to kind of pick up on that because there is a great deal of what I do that is creative writing. And what does that mean? Well, of course you have to do good scholarly work, and that is part of it, and that is part of the creative process. But there are many scholars who do good work who then never publish it, or publish it well below where it could otherwise be published because they don't position it well. And so, especially in a business journal, and I've published widely across engineering, science, business, you have to write in a way that conveys the value of this both to the discipline and what it adds that's significant and new, because you do a great piece of work and you send it to a top journal and you sometimes get back, and I just recently got one, that said very good work, but not sufficiently innovative to be in this journal. Consider these others. Luckily, I had another piece that they've asked us to revise for the same journal. So that's the first thing, that there is this obligation to do good scholarly work. There is this obligation to position it. That is the writing part. There are many scientists, engineers, business scholars who aren't good at the writing part. So specifically to that, I stay kind of dedicated to what I have to do. And so that means that in prior years when I was taking my children to art lessons, I took hard copy and edited hard copy while I was sitting in the car. Now my schedule permits me to sit down. Okay, I eat dinner and I sit down and we're all watching TV. Well, sort of. I'm in front of the TV with the computer and I'm working every night and it doesn't matter how tired you are. You work every night from roughly 8:30 to 10:30. If I'm lucky, I can shut it off at 10:30. Occasionally I have something I have to finish. But you've got to find time. You've got to find time that works for you no matter what you're doing in your life. And you've got to force yourself to do that. And there are many different mechanisms different people have. One of the things I do, for example, is create a set of bullets. Some people would say use an outline. But I just create a list of things that I want to write about, and then I go in and write about each one. And I was looking at this book. The best thing you can do is get it down first and go back and perfect it. Waiting to perfect it before you put it down is kind of a fatal flaw.
So Wes, I'm going to ask a different question. Many faculty members find it difficult to start writing. What do you do to get started, and what do you do to stay motivated?
In a way, that's the same as the question you asked everybody else.
It's really one I answered.
I think what I tend to do is try and think about what it is that has emerged from the data we have collected that is really interesting. And I kind of rehearse the first line of my introduction. And then I move on to the second line. Now, when I actually sit down and try and write them, they're never the way that it sounded in my head. In my head, it sounded really great, and I thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful, and I put it down, and I think, that's a run-on sentence. But I think what one has to do is try and, before you start writing, have some idea of what it is that you want to say. It is, to me, terrifying when I look at a mass of data and have no idea what I'm supposed to make of it. It only becomes a pleasure when you start to say, hey, well, I could make this point, and this clarifies that. So I think that the best thing to do to write well is perhaps to think about what it is that you want to write in advance, and then think about it in terms of, just as you were saying, what's novel, what's unique, what message do I want to send that hasn't been sent before?
So Victor, I'm going to pose a question to you. I know you've got some ways to kind of make sure you stay motivated to write. Can you describe some of those?
Sure. So first of all, there's two things. One I described already, which is a level of self-discipline, and that's somewhat critical to managing most things in life, and this is just one of them. The second is that over the years I've morphed what I do. When I was a brand new assistant professor, the burden was on me to do the majority of both some level of the intellectual work, in fact most of it, as well as all the mechanical work. And so, like, describing my life at that time, I always exercised. I would have to get up and exercise. So I had this rule, and it was I would get this amount done in the morning, and I only taught evening classes for the first decade or so as a faculty member. And I wasn't even allowed to shower or exercise till that was done. If I was lucky, that was 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes it was lunchtime before I was actually going out to run and getting started. And then I would go into campus after that. Now, why would I do that? Because I needed that level of isolation to force myself to work. But I eventually morphed into other things, like carrying my work with me while working in the car. I literally can work in the middle of a group of people if I have to. I do it all the time now, every night, with the TV on and the dogs and the cats and my wife and daughter around. And so the key is to sort of work at something that works for you initially, then leverage that and expand what works for you. If the only thing you do, you know, I know people like this, the only thing they can do is write in Starbucks. Well, that's great if Starbucks is open, but it's not always open, you can't always get to it. So you have to find a way to keep yourself moving, and that's the key. Regular activity. It's true in most things in life. It's also true here.
And following that, you know, we had a panel last year as well, and one of the panelists had mentioned that the way she really stays motivated to write is that every time she does writing, she rewards herself. So she puts money in the jar, and she's going to buy herself a trip to I don't know where when she does that. And so my goal is a jet ski. So, so how about you, Bruce? So
it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was thinking one way to motivate yourself is extrinsic rewards, like the one just mentioned. And we have within a university system, you know, various versions of that, extrinsic rewards. That said, that's not what motivates me. And I think if you can find that intrinsic thing in the work that connects somehow to what lies outside the writing itself, or even, you know, the ostensible subject, and it somehow connects to the rest of your life in some way, that is probably going to drive you a lot more. And it could be that the work is a lot more significant. I think we just had a visiting writer here, a wonderful poet, and she was asked a similar kind of question. You know, when do you write? These are the, you know, the kinds of questions that writers often receive. What works best for you in terms of your routine? But I think, and maybe this is somewhat specific to the discipline, I don't know. I don't think so. I think as this particular writer, and as I've progressed over the years, I think the boundary between writing and not writing has become a lot blurrier. So it's not this solitary space I go into in the morning, you know, from 9 to 11 or whatever. It's my entire life. It's the way I'm seeing. And if you can somehow find a way to integrate your process into what you don't now label as your process, I think that's going to drive you a lot more than any expensive reward.
So Wes, where and when do you write best?
I think that I have to be alone. I'm not very good at writing in company, because once I get started, I get really focused. And my wife would be very happy to tell all of you that when I say, I'll just be 2 more minutes, I just want to finish the sentence, that probably means half an hour until dinner is going to be able to be served. So I need to be alone. I find it very hard to write when other people are around, because I try to be polite, make conversation. It isn't that they bother me, it's just that I feel like I need to interact with them. So I need to isolate myself so I don't let my better half distract myself. And I guess that the other component as I have aged is I have to write when I'm awake. You know, it used to be I could stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning and be really sharp, but now around 10 o'clock I start writing the same sentence over and over again. And maybe this doesn't apply to anybody in the audience, but when that happens, it's a mistake to keep on. Go to bed, get up early, you will write much, much better.
That's great. I actually have to write when I'm asleep.
Well, to kind of build on something Bruce said before, and the same thing with Wes, it's like there isn't a time I'm not working. It's like my department chair said to me, well, you know, she's trying to figure out what hobbies I have in life. And she's like, well, what do you think about when you mow the lawn? I I think about my work. I'm always thinking about it, which is why I can kind of do it in a group. It's like, what's going on anyway in my head? I may as well be working.
But yeah, I think that you find this with a lot of people who are productive and especially, are writing something inspired. And I think that really applies to all the disciplines, that something may hit you in the middle of a concert or something, that suddenly your mind is working on the problem without you perhaps even being aware of it.
And so I pull out my phone and I write a note and I email it to
There we
myself.
are. Yeah, exactly.
So another question, I'll pose this to all of you. As faculty members, we have many commitments. Students need time, teaching, preparation, and grading take time. Committees take time, addressing email takes time, and often it seems that there is no time for anything else. How do you prioritize scholarship and writing?
Are you asking me?
All three of you, whoever would like to start.
Well, that's very, very difficult. It's not always easy. Usually I look at writing, the kind of writing I do is my fun thing, and I actually adore teaching and I like service, put it that way, and I think it's hugely important. I think all these modes of engagement actually, in my particular field, they can potentially feed my work. I mean, I'm getting ideas from other people all the time. That said, the challenge, especially with the service, which has been very heavy for me this semester, as is the teaching, the challenge is not so much time, it's motivation. You get home and you really need to relax your nervous system. You need to bring it to a still place in order to feel that surge again. Some people have days they set aside. I know early in my career, I decided, early morning, it'd just be a priority. I would do my writing first, and I would treat it like part of my job. And we're at a research institution, so you are paid to do research. It's not this extra thing. And I think, in some people, I don't know if it happens in this institution, but it's perceived as that extra thing. If you want to get tenure, you want to get a good raise, hey, then you throw in a little research. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as the core of my job. It's one core component. And so you need to treat it that way. And if that means turning some things down now and then in order to have that time, then do it. That's also your job.
So Victor, can you address this? And especially since you also went ahead of being an associate dean.
So first of all, I have to admit that doing the research is fun for me, but I've done a lot of things over the years. I've morphed from what I did early to what I've done in mid-career and what I'm doing now, which I won't call late career because I'm still very productive. But I've done things to engage doctoral students. So I've kind of morphed my teaching and my research together. And that makes it more enjoyable for me and has greatly increased my kind of leverage, but it's also increased my level of engagement. Rather than me having the burden of having to do all the mechanical stuff, I've got someone who can do a lit review, I've got someone who can run statistical analysis. I actually had to do a statistical analysis on a job, on a project recently because my co-author was my wife and I was lamenting that I didn't have a grad student on it. But I can still do it when I have to, and it's just, it's kind of the labor part. But at the same time, the issue is, how do I manage the other stuff? And I like it well enough, I just don't enjoy it at the same level. So I just do it very mechanically. I engage, I do what I have to do, I do it fast. I don't put off anything. I don't handle anything twice mentally. I get an email, I answer it instantly. And then it's done. And if it has to be dealt with, I send it to somebody who can deal with it, or I make a note by leaving it in my inbox, which is clear of everything I don't have to work on, that I will deal with it the next time I sit down and can. And then I deal with it and move on. So they don't, because like we talked about, work plaguing me when I'm mowing the lawn and any time else, which means that I don't want the trivia plaguing me. So that's got to be gone. So I take care of it by dealing with it. Even if it's very important in terms of the service commitment to the university, Most of that stuff is relatively mechanical in terms of getting it done. It requires dedication, it requires doing it, but it doesn't require the same level of intellectual engagement to do it. So you do it and get it and move on. And that's how I handle it.
Yeah, me too.
Actually, that's a hard question. It's an easy question in one sense, and my wife will say, "How was your day?" And I'll say, "It was terrible. I got nothing done today." And she said, "You worked 10 hours. How do you got nothing done?" Well, I was doing teaching, I was doing service, I was doing all these other things. But writing, I think writing down new, interesting findings that my group or my collaborators have discovered, pulling them together and trying to create something that I think other people will find interesting. They may not, but I kind of create this fictional person that I write for. That's the highest priority. I think what is a little bit difficult, and what I've said so far is a kind of abstraction. What is a little bit difficult is that there are some things that you sort of feel like you do need to do. You can't just say, I'm going to write all day because there are other commitments that one has. And it's hard to know exactly how to balance them. I'm a journal editor and I handle about 300 to 400 papers a year, and my editorial assistant is my wife, who is a very tough boss. She'll say, you've got this backlog of things you need to do. And it's hard to decide how to deal with that and how to deal with what I really want to do, which is to write. And I find that if I just keep on top of all these other things, I don't have any time to write. So at some point I have to say, I don't care if I make these decisions 3 days later, it isn't going to make any difference to the authors. They'll never know. I'm going to spend today writing because I have 2 hours now, but I could make it 4 hours if I don't do anything else. And so in that sense, it really does require a kind of creativity to say, look, I've got to create some space for myself.
So let me introduce our fourth panelist. So our fourth panelist is Richard.
Who is time challenged.
Are you blaming on the parking, Richard?
We could blame on the parking. I was actually went through a list of a couple different excuses. And one of them has some note to it. I was trying to help with a little hospice type thing for someone who I know. So I was emotionally kind of involved, but I wrote down the wrong time. So that's
So our fourth panelist is Richard Rogers. He's Regents Professor in Psychology. He has over 200 publications, numerous editorial boards, and has been an editor. He has many external awards, including recognition from the American Psychological Association and others, as well as from UNT. And his recent funding from NSF totals over $1 million. And so, Richard, the question that we're answering now is, as faculty members, we have many commitments. Students need time. We've got teaching, preparation for classes, and grading. They all take time. Committees take time. Addressing email takes time. And often it seems that there is no time for anything else. How do you prioritize scholarship and writing?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I don't think this has been my best year. In terms of compartmentalizing, and probably what I'll have to say is similar to what other folks have had to say. One thing I do, by the way, that my colleagues find absolutely infuriating is I don't open my UNT mail but maybe only twice a week. And I will catch this whole line of maybe 50 exchanges, and all of them were vitally important, I think, at the time. But the day or two later, they don't look very important to me. So one thing is not to do that, and don't let those things pop up on your screen, because that's the worst thing, because that's just a distraction. And my response to that is, oh shit, what another one of those damn things. Because it is an enemy of our productivity, having those distractions. And so that's what I try to do. And what I really try to do is, it sounds like, Victor, I think you were saying something, but you try to get passionate about something that you really care about. And one of the things I do is I try to be a little bit iconoclastic. So this oftentimes you'll get stuck in this kind of groupthink approach. And if there's any way you can take a project and kind of turn it on its ear, that I think can be something that's really good.
I think often as many junior faculty, I'm sure we've encountered many junior faculty who perhaps have a paper rejected and they often think it's the end of the world and perhaps it only happens to them. So first of all, have you had a book or manuscript or paper rejected? And second of all, if you have, what do you do and what don't you do?
Do you start with me?
Sure. If you
Yeah,
want to start
of course I've had things rejected, a lot of things rejected. I try not to put too much stock in either acceptance or rejection. I'm in a field where I will publish a lot of things that then are gathered and published again in a book form. And in choosing what to put in the book, I don't really put a lot of stock in, well, this poem has been published and this one hasn't. I think you've got to seize your own authority. You've got to not be defensive. I mean, don't let the ego hurt you, obviously. So if somebody gives you criticism, move forward with enlightened self-interest, I would say, and take what's valuable and try to be just as objective as you can, and not get too attached to anything. That said, it could be that the editor is wrong, or it could be that you're smarter than the editor, or it could be any number of things, right? And you may have to make a practical decision. That is, I mean, oftentimes, if an editor suggests something, if it's a make or break situation, it depends on, I might just say, sure, go ahead, yeah, publish it, and then I'll change it back, you know, and I put it in the book, something like that. I mean, that may be a small price. I've done that frequently, actually. But I think and what I tell my students a lot is try not to put too much stock in acceptance or rejection, either one. And try to grow into a sense of your own authority, and that means listening. And that means being objective, but it also means at times being bold and brave and seizing your own authority now and then, you know. I mean, being motivated, I like this thing about being iconoclastic, but because I feel exactly the same way, and how can light you with passion, but you don't want necessarily for that to become the obstacle, that to become the ego obstacle too. Like, I have to be contrary. And I'm sure everyone probably agrees with that. Go ahead.
So there's really a number of things that I do with, which is, you know, I'll give you the exact numbers. I happen to know them because I had a short bio for a recent acceptance I had to edit. I have 160 referee journal articles and about 180 conference proceedings presentations. I have more rejections than anybody in my college. I believe I have more published articles than anybody as well. I have them across a wide range of journals, including the most elite journals in the discipline, as well as much lesser ones. The first thing is, at this point in my career, I actually plan for it. I pick the best possible journal I believe I can disseminate the work in, and I target that. And I have an eye towards how good the piece is and how innovative it is and what journal it might hit, and I send it off. And now I know it's up to the luck of the draw with the reviewers, and I've got a second one planned and a third one. Unless those reviewers come back and dissuade me quite a bit from proceeding to number 2, I will stay the path. And so I'm already planning for that possibility at least. Sometimes the first one is it. More than likely I wind up at the second. But I use what they've given me in that review to at least better position the work to address the questions that I missed. So it may not mean redoing the work significantly. It may simply be admonishing myself with a limitation about the study, but that it still has an important contribution despite that. And by mentioning that more carefully, I may then go through that gauntlet. But I'll tell you a kind of funny story that's relevant. So I send off my first article. I finished my PhD, I went into industry to work with a group. I was the manager of a stack group at Campbell Soup, and I was trying to publish. And I sent it to a journal, and I got back what I thought were insurmountable revision requests. So I sent it to another journal, I got the same thing. And I sent it to a third journal after the second one did the same thing and got the same thing. And I happened to be working at the same time as an adjunct at Drexel University, which I then went back to as a faculty member. And I said to my former advisor that I was getting these reviews and that they weren't manageable, and he said, let me see them. And so now I'm very purposeful with my own students about how to respond to reviews, because I actually had 3 acceptances on the same article and had no idea. And the key is that when you get a revision request, you're not asked to do every single thing that they've requested. You're asked to address everything. And to understand the mechanics of doing that is probably just as important as doing the article in the first place. And so I go through very purposefully with my students how to publish before they get out. It's a requirement now to get a job as a faculty member, and I've chaired 20 dissertations at this point, and 18 of those are academics. The other 2 chose not to be. So, you know, I'm purposeful about that. I teach them to do this, and that is the key, to not let rejection prevent you from moving forward. It's not an issue of rejection in my mind. It's just an issue of, okay, did the reviewers understand what I did? Did I not present it well? Or was it just fate of the draw? You know, reviewers are very fickle. The extreme of this is we were looking at our journal list, and I sent this list off that has a combination of stat journals and OR journals, and a pretty well-known person who I know, and in operations research at Georgia State, reviewed it and said all the stat journals were in A journals, but all the OR journals were A journals. He's an OR. And a pretty good colleague who's a statistician did the exact opposite, who happens to be at OSU. I mean, those journals are all pretty respectable, but it's all in the eye of the beholder in that regard.
So Bess?
Everybody gets articles rejected. I'm a journal editor. I promise you I reject Nobel laureates' articles frequently. And they don't get angry because they know that everybody gets articles rejected. They had to say, oh, well, I guess I didn't convince the referees that this was publishable in JACS. I submitted somewhere else. So that's the first thing. And it's hard because we take what we produce as something very, very personal. So having a referee say your paper really is not very good is like having someone say your baby's really ugly, you know? And what you have to do is dissociate that. You have to realize that they are making comments which often are really helpful and well-intentioned. And it is very hard to learn not to take these things personally, as I know, because I have graduate students and postdocs to whom I will show reviews, and they're crushed. They'll say, oh, our paper got rejected. And I'll say, no, actually it's going to get in. You write the rebuttal letter, okay? Address each of the points, as you were pointing out. You don't have to make all the changes. Some of them are really stupid, some of the suggestions, but you just have to address them in a reasonable way. And one of the things that's important to do is, because in the sense of silly, but it really is important, is that there are lots of young people, that is, people who are young in their discipline, who feel as though when editors or referees make stupid suggestions, they should really beat up on those people and say, this person's really stupid. How could this referee have said something? Those are the people who are going to see the rebuttal letter. So what you say is, I really thank referee B for his insightful comments. However, so I think that those are the 2 things that I would say as being important. One is don't take it personally. The other is read the reviews carefully, see what it is that's being suggested. And although for the first 3 or 4 days you may be so angry that you can't really think about what you should be doing in response, after a while, when you feel somewhat dispassionate, see what it is that needs to be done to fulfill whatever the requirements are that the referees are asking for publication. One last thing in that is, which journal does one submit to, since that's important to know. You really do want to always shoot for the stars. Nothing's worse than getting a paper accepted in a second-rate journal with glowing reviews and feeling like, I should have submitted this to the best journal. And one thing one can do is, especially if one's starting out, you have colleagues, senior colleagues, who really want you to succeed, and they're anxious to help you. And take advantage of it. And so if you have a paper that you're about to submit, say, you know, I don't know where to submit this, what do you think? Do you think it's worth submitting to this tier 1 journal, or should I shoot a little bit lower? And probably they'll give you a fairly frank assessment. And if you don't like their assessment, go to another colleague. But it is important, I think, to eventually develops a sense for this is good enough for this journal, this is not good enough for this journal, I should really be publishing here, otherwise I'm going to waste my time. And always sending something to the best journal just means that referees will ultimately think you're a fool for thinking that your stuff is, for thinking that mediocre stuff is really good stuff.
And definitely be reassured that, the journal editors, I mean, I think all of us have been journal editors, they're not always right. I had a paper that was rejected by Journal of American Chemical Society, and I was told, it didn't even go out for review because I was told it was not of broad enough interest. Interestingly, it was picked up by the New York Times, and it hit 200 other media outlets, which is kind of rare for a theoretical chemistry paper. So we were pretty happy about that. So do know these things happen, and editors are not always right. So don't feel that, oh yeah, my paper, I understand it, it didn't end up in that journal, it's not good enough. That's not it, So just realize. So, Richard, say
yeah. Well, the first thing I do is I get angry. And you may be right. So I'm not saying that I think it's far better than getting depressed over the and as we've talked about here, there are different qualities. So sometimes, in fact, you knew these were flaws, and they're literally legitimate, because all research has flaws. And so you knew it was there, you really thought it could have a better self. But my sense is to just look that up, and to sit on it maybe for a week or so, until you, in fact, can feel like you can kind of get back to this, and kind of pull things apart. The whole idea of this, of it being unfair. I mean, I think that probably about a third of decisions are unfair. Now, the ones which are unfair that we actually get into, we don't really complain about a whole bunch. But those which are unfair that we don't get into, we tend to complain. So I had two rejections from first-tier journals in the last 3 weeks, I think. So this has been a roaring good month. And in one of them, I had actually meticulously done every change. I was philosophical and polite about the stupidities, and there weren't many, maybe 10 or 20% of those. 8-page letter back, and as opposed to it was a revised resubmit, I was pretty confident. My name got for review. Well, for review, I bothered somebody really badly, and they rejected it. So there you go. The one advice about always shooting for the best, I like to temper that a bit. And the way I like to temper is just by a different perspective. If you're going for tenure, you need to look at least in psychology, some of these things take a god-awful amount of time. And you don't maybe have the time to put another 4 months before they get through the review process, etc. And so I think being pragmatic is good. I have used, as several folks have said, I have used, sometimes I knew this wasn't the best article in the world, but I wanted the best reviews in the world, so I intentionally sent it to a place that had a relatively low likelihood of success, but with the idea that I could then build this into the very best paper I could have. I don't think you do that often, but I think that's something you can do.
Add something. Well, at least in my field, and I suspect it's the same with every field. I tell my students that they're wasting their time if they get a list from someone. These are the best journals, okay, and these are your best poems or whatever, or essays, and then, okay, send it away. They have to be a lot more discriminating in defining what that journal is than simply how it's ranked. So I think the important thing is to try to pick the brain of whoever it is making a decision. Now, I know when you send to a place and it's refereed, it's generally anonymous. But still, there tends to be a personality associated with various journals. And you need to read the journal, try to determine that personality, and then be very, very nuanced in your thinking. Does this really fit that conversation? And look at journals as communities. That's what I do. And there's some communities where you want to be part of the conversation. They want you as part of the conversation. See if that's a reasonable thing, before you send your stuff off. Is this the same in all disciplines?
I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, your story about how different people rank them suggests that.
And when I say, one of the things I said the best journal that you can potentially target it for. That's an eye towards positioning as much, which is what you're talking about, as much as it is the ranking. And then within that, there are discipline-specific nuances that you must pay attention to. One more quick addition, which is kind of building on what everybody here said. I try to keep it as unemotional as possible. It's just my approach to life. I've developed this through living out early years in an inner city Philadelphia project that you would be hard-pressed to survive in today. But so be it, I got out of there. And when I get a review that the reviewer says, you didn't do this, My co-authors frequently, say, well, we did that. How could they not have read it? They didn't read it. I don't even think about it. I apologize immediately for not having been sufficiently clear, and then I rewrite those few sentences so they can't accuse me of not having made a change, and say, now on page 4, which it always was on, in paragraph 2, we have carefully rephrased that section to address this concern and hope it's improved the readability for the journal's readership.
Do you really say we?
Yeah. My advisor had to do the royal we, and I'm stuck with it for decades now. It's very silly, but it's my habit. It works. Except in journals that won't allow for first person, and then I'm just like, okay, how do I write around this?
I want to touch on a couple of things panelists have said, and certainly, something Bruce mentioned was that, the importance of really looking at the scope of the journal. I'm a journal editor, and I also handle about 300, 400 papers a year, and it's amazing to me how many authors submit a paper because they think the title fits along with their research area, but even among that title, there's a very focused scope of types of papers that we deal with. And I cannot tell you how many papers I just reject. I read the abstract and the journal, and it's completely off from what we accept. And so clearly the authors have not only not read the description of the journal, they've not looked at the table of contents, nor have they looked at any of the articles in the journal. And so, don't think that you're going to be the one who's got this paper in a different area and you're going to change the journal. There's a lot of journals out there and lots of different possible journals that you can go to. So don't try to force your paper that maybe fit, along with other triangles into something that's a circle-shaped type of journal. It's so critical that you really hit upon the appropriate journals. I hate to reject those papers, and because I know that sometimes trying to put things in the right journal format can be a real pain in the neck, and they're not necessarily same from one journal to the next, and so that's a real issue. And I really loved what Richard said was that, he doesn't get depressed, he gets mad. And certainly dealing with students and with postdocs, some of them will go depressed and some of them get mad. And when they're mad, I tell them, write a rebuttal. And so I tell them, so then they're not sitting there stewing about it for days on end. They put the words down in paper, and they've got the angry response, the idiot referees, idiot whatever. And then a few days later, I tell them, okay, now tone it down so we can actually get this paper accepted. But it really is a useful exercise because then it's all behind them. They've not gotten depressed, they've gotten their anger out, then they can write a nice, reasonable review. So I have another question for all of you, because all of you have certainly reviewed much work of other people. So in reviewing the work of others, what do you find are the most common problems, and how can these problems be avoided? And I'll start with you, Wes.
Thank you for giving me so much time to think about the answer to that question.
You're welcome. I keep picking on Bruce, so.
I think that probably the most common problem I see as an editor is people who are basically turning the crank. They're publishing the same thing that other people have published. This is the 43rd calculation on water. I think that is. It's tempting because you figure if everybody else is publishing this kind of paper, I'm going to get it accepted. But I think that is not a very good way to make a name for oneself. You want to try and find something to do that is unique, something that will, in fact, look to others like you've done something creative. And the best judge of whether that is true or not is probably how you feel about your own work. So if you feel like your work, if you feel you have a story to tell that other people should read, that's probably really good and should be published. If you feel like, well, we've done this and I don't know what else to do, I'm up for tenure, I better publish this, that probably is not very good work.
And reviewers for tenure will recognize that.
Yeah.
Richard.
Just to echo something you were saying, Wes, I think there is a herd instinct. And the herd instinct is, follow all these other people down the same pathway. and I think that's unfortunate. There's a lot of psychology journals, and I would say no, I'm not an editor. I'm an editorial board of, I think, 5 different journals. So you get to see a wide array of stuff. And I'd say that about half of this stuff falls into that unpleasant category called schlock. You can translate that to any other, that's the word you would like. And so one thing is to actually say, am I really doing real research? And so some reviews are really pretty fast because it's very clear this person isn't. In psychology, one of the areas I think is in terms of, is it clear how this is theory or conceptually driven? So, it's easy enough to put together empirical studies, but where does it fit, with scaffolding, kind of some kinds of conceptual thoughts? One of the things that really ticks me off when I review things is when you choose a sample, because we need human subjects for the most part, when you choose this just on the basis of convenience. So I've reviewed dozens of studies of psychopaths, those evil, nasty little bastards, which were done with college students. So either you're teaching at a school that is really quite different from most schools, or you got it completely wrong.
Bruce, do you want to?
Well, 2 things. And I think the first is relevant to all disciplines, but it's especially relevant to the humanities. I want to see work that honors, regards, invests a lot of energy into both word and world, and that sees the relationship between the two, that your subject matter is not something simply divorced from the means of rendering it. And so that's one thing. But the other thing, which is obviously relevant to all disciplines, is the kind of depth and development of the kind of conceptual energy that you have, the sense of momentum. If you're going to bring in another thinker, I think that in the humanities there might be this sense that, okay, I have to validate the authority of what I'm doing by including the larger conversation. That's kind of what we're all taught. And actually, in my field of English, that is a practice that is very, very specific to the invention of English departments. I mean, if you look at the history of literary criticism, the history of philosophy, it was not always the case that there was this effort to quote all, the critics of the time. I know that is the convention now. You should honor that if you're shooting for a certain kind of journal, but you don't want to get into the trap of making all these illusions and it's not contributing to the momentum and depth of your vision. So I think one important thing in terms of brainstorming, a piece, when I see a piece that is asking the radiant question and then the next related, fascinating question. Same thing with a poem. These have to do, it's very difficult, in a poetry writing class to teach vision, but it's really helpful to relate it to this notion of asking questions and asking the right ones, right? That is, and I like this idea of a story. I mean, look at the sort of meditative argument as a kind of story, that holds together. And as you bring in the larger conversation, it has to be a very important, essential part of that story.
Victor.
So it really depends on the level of scholarship of the submitted piece, which as you go to better journals, they tend to get better, but not always. There's one of the biggest things that kind of leans back into the story thing and builds on what Dick said was the level of connection between what your story is and the actual study that you've conducted, and making that nuanced enough to really make the case and show the contribution. So, at different levels, I've seen poorly done studies that have a good front end, and I've seen poor front ends, the good studies. When they both start to get good, it's getting better, and now the question is, have you made the contribution? And contribution, even then, is in the eyes of the beholder to some extent. Going back to this issue of doing something new, I teach a doctoral course in the first year of the program, and I see students who tend to rely on what was done before to the point that they're doing nothing new. And that's bad in and of itself. And I see students who feel that they have to build everything from ground zero, which also is fraught with kind of problems because the likelihood that every piece of it holds up is not great. So there's some balance between how original your contribution is, how significant it is in the discipline, and how much new you're doing that you've got to strike in order to make a contribution. And that's probably back at the original inception of the work. But even then, telling that story to get it there, it's not trivial. It's kind of why we're here, I suppose.
So I have another question, and I'm not going to ask Bruce because I already know the answer to this one. How do you overcome writing blocks? I believe Bruce will say he doesn't have any. But I'll start with you, Richard.
Yeah, I think the important thing is not to get them. So, I'm being serious. I think honestly it is keeping momentum, getting challenged by the topic that you have, and not getting them. I think the best way to get, I'm going to answer the question a little differently, but I think the best way to get a writing block is to start something, put it aside for 2 or 3 weeks, pick it back up again, start it again, put it aside for several weeks, and pick it up again, and you see where this goes. I've had one student who did this and ended up after 4 years leaving with a master's degree, because that was such a horrible thing to do to yourself. So I actually believe that one way of not doing this is that you get excited about what it is that you want to do. That will carry you a long ways. There was something I read as a kid, because I knew I was going to be a novelist at the time, that I thought was kind of good. It was from Jack London in terms of, the Hollywood he wrote. And that is not to finish things. So if you have to leave it, if in fact if you could leave the part which you're working on perhaps in the middle of a paragraph, or if you're really daring, in a part of a sentence. So the worst thing you can do is just finish up something that, I'm thinking more conceptual than empirical, is to finish it up, but to actually leave it undone. So when you come back to it, it's not, what the hell was I thinking of for this new section? It's like you can get back into the flow of it a lot easier.
So, Victor?
So, I agree, regular work. I recently had a student who finished his dissertation, and he took a full-time lecturer's job at Georgia State, and my advice to him was pretty much what I've told you. I don't care how tired you are. I know you are teaching 4 courses every night at 9 o'clock. Sit down and work for an hour. And it's not the hours work every night that means as much, but it's that you don't let it sit for 2 weeks. So what I do myself is I sit down, I work just about every day, 7 days a week, and I do some amount of work. And I usually have to finish something because I can't leave that. But then I make a quick list of those things that have occurred to me that I want to address when I come back. And that list is there for me to start up next time. And it's much easier to do that than put it down for 2 weeks and try to remember where I was, because I'm just too busy and I've got too many other things going on, and I suspect that's true for almost everyone. And so I would be lost at that point. I'd be restarting, and the startup time would be inordinate and painful.
Wes?
In one way, the answer is don't succumb to a writer's block. I think that's right. That one shouldn't allow oneself to get blocked, which doesn't mean that one doesn't feel blocked at times. But what I find is that if I'm working on something and there's a section I really don't know how to write, but I write it anyway. Because if I write it anyway, I'll see what it is that I don't really quite get right. And then I'll write another section and go back and say, yeah, now I can rewrite this section. So I think what everyone is saying is basically don't stop. Don't say, oh, now I'm blocked. I can't write anymore, because then it's very, very hard to get started.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, William Stafford, the poet, was asked about that, and he said, lower your standards. And you can raise them later.
And good writing, in my case, is the result of good editing. I'll write it and edit it 20 times before it's out the door.
Yeah.
But at least I got it down.
And another strategy, I have a student who's got pretty severe writing blockages, and so what I've told him to do, because he's more than happy to share with anyone orally in terms of the work that he's done, and he'll talk it out. So I told him, record yourself. record yourself and then go back and, write down kind of, the story that emerged from the story that you're telling orally. And it really has helped him out quite a bit. So that's another way to try to overcome writing blocks. I mean, there's many books on the topic. Sometimes they help, but sometimes they actually make the problem worse. But definitely that can be a very useful way to try to overcome them.
I think also the more you write, perhaps if there is a block, the nature of it changes. It has less to do with how I have to find where's my voice. I have to find my voice.
Definitely.
So just doing it a lot, getting a lot of practice, I think will gain fluency.
And to be fair, 30 years later, it's different for me than it was when I was starting, but I did exactly what you said. I had a dictaphone. I talked into it, and then I sat down and transcribed it myself. And I wound up editing my own text, but at least I got something out.
Definitely, and what Bruce said, it definitely gets easier, initially. If you're not someone who feels natural about writing, trust me, it gets a lot easier as you write more and more papers. So that's the good news.
Everyone has sort of said this, but I think this was actually the first question Angela asked last year, which was, what does it take? How do you become a good writer? And the answer is simple: practice. How do you become a good violinist? Well, you don't sit and think about it. You play the violin, as awful as it sounds. At first, eventually, it'll start to sound pretty good. As awful as you may feel your writing is when you first write your first paragraph or your first paper, it will get better. But the only way it will get better is if you persist, continue, practice.
Yeah, and what's considered good writing in different disciplines, it can vary dramatically, but to get interested in that aspect of your discipline, the actual, putting together of sentences, which is to say you're interested in my field, you're interested in English, the English language, I would encourage you to expand your resources in terms of the ways that you construct sentences and so forth. It'll make your writing a lot stronger, and you'll be able to do a lot more different kinds of things in it. It'll be a lot more fun to read, for one thing. But I think it also will have an effect on the way you think.
And actually, I think it's great to continue to I think Bordon is an absolute, I can say this, he's in my field, an absolute phenomenal writer. But last year I was very impressed because after the writing session, he emailed Bruce a paragraph or a couple of sentences and said, Bruce, how would you phrase this?
Oh, well, that's impossible.
I was going to mention that, but it was really very helpful.
Well, first of all, it's impossible to do because what I was encouraging was, technically what discourse means is that, logically connected language. There's another name for it, and that is hypotaxis. What hypotaxis is, I explained this last time, but maybe you all know, and I apologize. But it's language that involves subordination. So the art of the subordinate clause, it changes the way you think. Suddenly you have to now make stronger logical connections as you unfold your statements, and you're not just making a declarative statement with your subject first every time and that kind of thing. People do that because it's safe, but you're not risking as much in terms of your analytical energy that way.
Certainly we don't all have access to Bruce. I'm sure he keeps busy writing his own 700, 800 publications. But certainly it's very important to have other people read your work before you send it out. A couple of reads would be very useful and kind of get perspective on other ways to present it. And so actually, Wes has kind of gone down a pathway here that I wanted to talk about, and that is what strategies do you recommend to strengthen writing? So you've already heard a couple, and I don't know if anyone else would like to chime in on this. Richard?
I missed a couple of words you said there. You already heard a few examples of, and I'm sorry, I missed.
Oh, okay. So what strategies do you recommend to strengthen writing?
So I'll take a stab at this initially, and it is that I was actually not a very good writer when I did my dissertation. It was one of the things I never learned in the inner city project school, and so, just go through and do a science and engineering degree. And so I wasn't a good writer, and I wrote very mechanically. And I still do to some extent, because that's the easiest way to get it down. But in any event, I went and bought a book that you might be familiar with, Angela, by I think it's Menzel. It was how to write a technical paper by a chemist. And I followed it almost like a formula, and it was, wow, this works. And so I kind of did that for a long time. And I had this, so the bottom line is, eventually I got more subtle about it, like what journal am I trying to publish in? How do they write in that journal? How's the introduction written? How are they structuring their arguments? And I started improving beyond what I was already doing, and I just kept working at it. I still do. You know, along the way, kind of building on what Bruce said, I had this student who had been a former journalist, and I was kind of doing what my advisor had done, which is teaching me to write sort of the way he did. Eventually, he asked me to edit some of his stuff, which is interesting comment. But, you know, I had this student who wrote, and I started editing his stuff, and I looked at it and said, you know, I really think his writing is as good as mine, it's just different. Let's send it off. And we got into a very strong writing, probably the #2 operations research job. And I thought, well, that's a lesson to me, and I learned from it. And so I'm more tolerant of more diversity, and I started experimenting more. And I think it comes down to what we keep saying. First, you have to master the mechanics. Then you have to continue to develop, and you have to keep at it. It's just like everything else.
Good writing is kind of like really great math in that you want to communicate the most complexity with the, you know, kind of most elegant, simplest terms. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Adequate sense of complexity.
Richard, do you want to add to this one?
I was majored in English, so that helped me a whole bunch, I think. You had to write all these essays, et cetera, and I kind of bemoan in psychology we don't have writing classes for folks. I think we've got some great advice. I think one thing to do is sit down, and one possibility is just read it out loud, and you can see how mundane it sounds. One of my bugaboos is in terms of, because we do a lot of, you know, empirical research, is how people decide that in fact is the results chapter of their thesis or dissertation, or of an article for that matter, has to be dry as dust, has to be the most boring, unutterable thing without any adverbs. And so I actually really ask people I'll send something back in terms of a draft and ask folks, I'd like to see some adjectives and adverbs in here. I'd like to see some verbs, not verbs of being. I'd like you to kind of be thinking about this. And the other piece of it is, I think Bruce, you were saying this in a slightly different way, but if you can compare and contrast, if you can have within either the sentence or within the paragraphs an idea of where the tension is, this makes it so much more interesting for the writer than if you kind of present, you know, I came, I saw, I conquered, you know, I think in terms of Caesar, you know, it was just this this progression following. Life is never that way, and I don't know of any discipline that is. So if you can build in that tension and build in how this fits within contrasting views, I think that's interesting. One word which I forbid people to use, although I really don't, is the word similar. Because once you say the word similar, then in fact is, where do you go with the rest of the analysis? And almost always it's never similar, because it's with different groups and with probably different measures, et cetera, to in fact to say, tell me where it's different. And then you can put the word similar in dependent clause if you'd like. But I don't want you to end there, because that's the end of the interest in the topic.
Yeah, I tell students with regard to difference too, the fact of difference is never as interesting as the character of it. I mean, so, you know, there's a sentence you can skip in terms of, you know, resting on that particular category of difference. Another thing, just in terms of practical advice, if you're moving your language toward a texture of greater complexity, it may be tempting to just add what are called bound elements. Those are syntactical elements that aren't set off by pauses. And I remember early on, I taught from a rhetoric text. I still remember this quote because I thought it was so cool, that it's pauses, not clauses, that make for an adequate sense of complexity. Did I mention that last time? I don't remember if I did. That might have been connected to, you know, our exchange later on. That is to say, good writing, it has to honor the element of time and the way that's related to cognition, the way that's related to your ability to absorb language. And so good writing is really related to the art of silence, the art of where to put a silence within a sentence. in order to accumulate this adequate sense of complexity and have a sentence that really resonates and it moves towards significant. By the end of it, it feels like, oh, that was a significant and beautiful thing. But in order to do that, sometimes it's like, you know, those really long German words that you encounter, oh my God, how can anyone cognitively absorb all that? Well, you know, a sentence that is not technically a run-on, but it feels like it runs on because there's no pause. Well, I think of that as a big steak that you need to cut into pieces, you know. And so, you know, and it's not a matter of inserting commas, it's a matter of sculpting syntax to do it. So there are a lot of strategies to do that.
My advisor had something for me when I started writing, which wasn't, as I said, very good. And it was never say in one sentence what you can say in two. and that precise, terse language worked a lot better.
Well, that can work very well, yeah, because there's a lucidity. Yeah, I would say also, you know, this is to echo Pound, and to go in fear of adjectives and adverbs, you know, to use them with great discretion. You know, I mean, use them only when necessary, because that's a matter of, it takes time, and it affects cognitive speed, not just normal, you know, temporal speed as we know it, but cognitive speed. You know who the people who understand this so well? Stand-up comedians. They're poets, really. I mean, that's what I tell them. Yeah, these are people who understand the relationship between time and language and expressive power.
So right now, is there anyone in the audience that has any questions? Yes?
So you have spoken so much about writing for journals, which is the major part of what we all do or are expected to do. Would you all share something about writing to a different audience, say a textbook, a chapter, or God forbid a case, or an encyclopedia article? Is that valuable? What do you all think?
Well, for me, we write mostly journals, articles in psychology, and I think that probably is where the action is. So one thing is, I think people have said this different ways. You have to know your enemy. You have to know really who you're writing for and who the audience of that is. Much of my work is done in both psychology and law, and I'm doing a few things in criminal justice. And that's an eye-opener, because it helps you then to see, in fact, is what it is that you're really working on and how will this actually get people's attention. So I view in the idea of a mythical person out there that you're doing, I try to picture what this audience is like. And part of that is from looking at the different journals there, assuming that the editors and the editorial board are shaping us in that direction. I try to imagine, and our field is a sciences practitioner, so that there are some folks who just do science as a higher proportion of folks who are out there in clinical practice. So those kinds of divisions, but even within that, try to get a sense of who that audience might be. So you have some vague notion of, will this resonate? Having said that, you might be wrong. In fact, you might be wrong more of the time, but even having that image in your head, I think, actually helps you to write more coherently.
I've spent most of my career writing scientific articles, but now I'm at an age when people ask me to write little things about myself for various publications. And I guess the one piece of advice I would give is try to be amusing. I think that, for instance, there's a collection of essays by people who won a particular prize in chemistry. And I've read some of the others, and they're all very serious and, you know, sort of like, well, I'd much rather watch YouTube than I would read this. This is not very, you know, it's pretty dry. I think it's much better if you inject a little bit of humor and a little bit of humility. I like to tell stories about myself, about how stupid I was or how silly I was or whatever. And I think that is something that makes reading much more enjoyable than just very dry prose of, you know, I went to A and then I did B and then C told me this.
So there's a caveat on this. Right? You have to know your audience, just like you do for different journals, and you have to position, but you have to not over-position. And that is that there are still some characteristics of good writing that transfer from any kind of writing to any other type of writing to some extent. And so what do I mean by that? I'll give you a very specific example that you might know, Production Inventory Management Journal. I sent a case study to them back in about 1987, and Gene Woolsey was the editor. And he, luckily for me, had reviewed and accepted a contingent revision, major revision, although risky. And that's when I bought that book by Menzel on how to write a technical article. And I took this case that I tried carefully to craft as a case and fit it into introduction, lit review, methodology, results, and conclusion, and sent it back to him. And he said it was the best rewrite he saw in 14 years as an editor. There's a lot of things that people overplay, you know. Yeah, it had some elements of a case, and yes, it was different, but it wasn't really that different, and I had kind of lost the thread of what was going on by virtue of being all over the place in this case format I tried to follow.
Did you want to add?
No.
No, okay. Other questions?
I have a question for you, Angela, and it was one of your questions, but I'd like to hear your response. And it was the question on the balance of teaching, service, and when do you find time to write?
My favorite time to write is on the airplane.
Okay. That's a great time.
On the airplane. Traveling is a wonderful time. Strangers are great, but I don't want to have a conversation with them necessarily. I just put a headset on and completely focus. The white noise of the plane is a wonderful time to write. I actually do my best writing either very, very early in the morning before the kids get up or very, very late at night. Although I'm finding what Wes mentioned, you know, it's harder to stay up later and later these days.
Mm-hmm.
So it's often getting up early and working on that. So I always try to write at least a couple hours every morning when I can. So.
And did you want to answer any of the other questions? That would be a...
I think I kind of did along the
Okay.
way, so definitely. For anyone who is interested, we do have a faculty writing group, and just either email me, I'm Angela Wilson, or Teresa Golden at tgolden@unt.edu, and we're more than happy to include you in the group. We've got a nice, quiet place, thanks to West Bordon, to do some writing, and occasionally we have like writing day marathons. So if you want to come in and just kind of sit with other people, get away from the knocking on your door, your email, all that, you're welcome to join us. And I want to finish off with one other point and then one other question. Certainly I want to acknowledge Christy Kretzinger, the Vice President for Faculty Success, for supporting this and other types of initiatives like this. And then I want to give all of you kind of a chance for a final comment. And basically, what advice would you provide to new faculty about writing, or anything else you want to tell the faculty about writing? Victor, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So basically, I've kind of summarized this several times, and I'll repeat it. You're all bright enough to do anything you want to do. You have to decide to be purposeful about it, to be at least emotionally unengaged enough to break it down into its components and pursue those components so that you learn and get better at it. And that's really what you need to do. In terms of kind of a commercial plug, Jim Miernick and I have a mentoring group as well, and it's got a lot of associate profs and some folks who want to continue to be productive. And we've gone through a variety of topics, and we meet the third Friday of every month. If you're interested, send me an email or send Jim Miernick an email if you know him. And we'd be happy to have you join. And we're actually applying for yet a new grant, so we may continue to meet next year. We meet in places like Kerr Cafeteria. Sometimes we meet in a building and have a lunch delivered. But we do that on Fridays and have a couple of other activities. Thank you, Angela, for allowing us to use your writing facility one time. Our group did that as well.
That's a thanks to Wes.
Thanks.
Wes.
Practice.
That was succinct.
Good writing should be succinct.
Yeah, one thing, and I'm not sure this translates into every field, but if you can help at some time in your career to build, I wrote a few initial notes, a better yardstick, whatever that is, something that will help us in terms of the measurement of a construct or an idea that you need to look at. That can be a hugely generating approach. I oftentimes see researchers, again in psychology and law, always using the same measures, etc. Without, it's a formidable thing to do depending on how far you take this. But you can actually have a real effect both if you could help in a particular area to develop a scale or something else that was more refined than what was there before. You can see how that can be something of a catalyst. The work, which I did over a 5-year period, was looking at, can we tell people who are really crazy from people who are pretending to be crazy? But it happens a lot more than what you'd think, in terms of that. And it's been used a couple 100,000 cases, and so you can look at the solid knowledge research that can actually really help. So depending on the area, you can help both generate scholarship, but it can actually perhaps make a real difference.
Bruce?
Well, I've already said a lot that I think kind of relates, but in terms of junior faculty, somebody's just coming on, I would say get started early, and if you're in a book-driven discipline, try to get the book in the mail in your 4th year, 5th year, something like that. It can take a long time for people to get back on it. If you get it rejected, you gotta have time to send it somewhere else, or if you need to do revisions, that if your acceptance is contingent upon revisions, that's not sufficient for tenure. So you need, the other thing, I mean, we do a lot in our department to really support people on tenure. I would always, offer my mentorship, that kind of thing. If you're a junior faculty, you might want to take advantage of those kinds of offerings and opportunities. But I tell them, your job right now is to get tenure. And I want people to take it seriously in their 1st year and not just think, oh, I got 6 years. I'll just kind of get socially acclimated, and I would just get to work right away. Get that out. You'd be much happier if you've got like enough for tenure in your 4th, 5th year. Right?
I can't reiterate enough, but my students, I'm really purposeful about this. Not only do we have some publications before they walk out the door, not only do we craft what's likely to be the publications out of the dissertation, but we plan for tenure before they walk out. So I had a student who just had a job offer. I said, wonderful. Next we start planning for what you need to do for tenure. Because if you set it up before you leave our campus, when you walk in and you have to do your new preps and you do this, you've got a blueprint that you can follow. The likelihood of succeeding is much greater than 3 months later waking up and say, oh, where'd the 3 months go and now what do I have to do? It's not any different than anything we've talked about. You don't want to restart every time.
Yeah.
And the criteria for tenure is to show that you've got continuous growth. It's not just this big push at the very end. And certainly, we've seen, at least in the science and engineering areas, there's certainly a number of faculty who try to kind of, not publish a lot kind of along the way and have this big push at the end. That's not sufficient. It's very important to have those publications kind of all the way through. And it's so important to make sure that you have set aside the time. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by the teaching, by the service. Everyone's asking you to be on committees, and so you don't want to say no. Talk to your chair, let your chair be the bad guy or the bad gal who helps you say no if you don't feel comfortable saying no, because it's really absolutely critical that you preserve that time. And like Victor said, daily time is so critical. So I think I see a question.
Well, do you have any advice for associates going up level? Like planning, like you said, you plan for students to go up, before they go out the door, they have obligations. But, and especially from associate before, there is no set number of
And
years.
it's not just more of the same. You need to actually go to yet another level to get there.
Try to aim for some other journals.
I think sorry, go ahead. Well, there are 2 challenges at the associate level. I mean, you're expected to do more service, so to what extent is that cutting into, your time? And I've noticed, being on the Dean's PAC, sometimes there will be questions raised if there is a long period, a hiatus of inactivity. So I would try to keep the momentum going, even in those periods of heavy service. And also create, generally, universities don't want to give tenure or full professor to people who will just rest on those laurels. They want a sense of that momentum continuing until they retire, ideally.
or kill over is
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying.
I was going to say that my research advisor was a Nobel laureate, and I thought he had the answers to everything, so I said, you know, what's the best advice you could give me for my getting tenure? And he said, do chemistry and tenure will take care of itself. And I think that's really true.
Yeah.
You're excited about your research. Don't worry about being promoted. Don't worry about tenure. Just do your research. Do it with passion. You are smart enough to know that you need to publish it. You're smart enough, I think, to know that you need to publish it in journals that will gain you some recognition. But I think less important than the sort of technical aspects of do A, B, C, D, and E are we are remarkably fortunate. How many people in the world get to do whatever they want? And we get to do pretty much whatever we want in terms of our research.
Yeah.
And to waste that, feeling like, oh, I've got to do this because otherwise I won't get tenure, is really a shame. I feel that my happiest moments come when I'm really excited about what I'm doing. And I hope all of you have some of that passion in your own work, and then you don't need to worry about tenure or getting promoted to full professor or winning awards. It'll naturally come.
And I would say, from the trajectory perspective, both at the assistant, which we were talking about earlier, you don't want what Angela's suggesting is where the big pushes at the end. Even worse there is where the person is doing really well and then they taper off like, I think I can make past the finish line. That doesn't go over well. And just to reiterate what other folks have said from associate to full, I think the ideal is where we see a steady production, maybe not increased production, but higher quality research. I know this is very discipline specific, but you're looking for that. And you're looking for that in areas where full professors at least the same level of universities in terms of scholarship, however one measures that, are going to be able to say exceptionally good things about you. So that becomes, we were talking about before with reviewers, I must say, having done a bunch of these things in terms of people going up, writing external letters, you realize that who you get is in fact is critically important. And one negative letter could really dampen that experiment. So there's that skill and perhaps strategic side of it.
That's why going to conferences and meeting people is absolutely critical.
For those of you who have like hundreds of articles, I'm kind of curious how much you recycle. Like do you use a similar article and send it to another journal and build on 20% new stuff, or is it all the time totally new? What is the ratio of that kind of economics?
But, and this is, I think, very discipline specific. So you want to have a research program, so you're not learning something completely new each time, because you build on your reputation, although these are all masked reviews, or blind reviews, they're all masked, but still, it's a finite, so people know. But at least within the fields where I publish, if you do piecemeal things or et cetera, that's considered a very big no-no, and that will come back to bite you. So that may well...
It's basically true.
Right.
I mean, there's always this like, what does it mean to recycle, I guess, is what you're talking about. But like, I have several different research streams, so I'm not as specific as some, but let's just say in the area of service quality. If I publish a study where I look at the urgent care perception in terms of the patient satisfaction and a variety of other constructs that might affect their perception, and I've done a study of patients that received urgent care. And then I've also collected data where I've compared it to primary care physicians, and I've also collected data comparing it to ERs. I might initially publish an overall model, and then I might go in and just segment service quality as a portion of that, and gender and the impact on the perception of service quality in a particular environment. But I've got to rewrite it, I've got to reposition it, and I'm only using a portion of the data, and that's about as far as I'll go. It's easier to just do a new study.
In the sciences, there are new studies. I mean, you might do a book chapter, review chapter, But, overall, they're new studies. I mean, there may be an extension to a study, but for the most part, you try to get everything in one paper. The paper has a lot more impact than, in fact, I'm an editor for a journal where a lot of people try to recycle their work. Trust me, the plagiarism detector picks it up, these similar phrases and all that, and once it hits about 20% or more, I really take a lot of scrutiny at it, and often the paper will be rejected, and sometimes we will ban the authors for a year from submitting again to the journal.
There's such a thing as a research agenda, which happens to be pretty important, especially when you're going up for full, just in terms of becoming known and respected in your field. I think diversity is a great thing, but it's often, radical diversity. Say we have someone who was hired in 18th century studies, now he's writing more modern drama. That's generally a luxury you can take when you've already gotten full. Correct. Yeah. The other thing is, I've only written one poem, I just changed the title. So that's not but it works.
Well, why don't we go ahead and wrap up, and so let's thank our distinguished panelists as well as Dr.